Napoleon's mistake. Why a genius failed the law of knowing when to stop. How Napoleon conquered Europe, but lost everything by not knowing when to quit. Picture this for a moment. You're sitting at the absolute pinnacle of power, controlling half of the European continent, commanding unbeatable armies, being feared and respected by kings and emperors alike. You are literally the most powerful man in the known world, and then you lose it all. Not from lack of strategy, not from cowardice, but from one fatal mistake that destroys empires: not knowing when to stop. This is the true story of Napoleon Bonaparte, and today you're going to discover how one of history's greatest military geniuses made the most expensive error of his life. More importantly, you'll learn how to recognize that crucial moment in your own journey before it's too late. By 1807, Napoleon was at the absolute height of his power. He had crushed Austria, humiliated Prussia, forced Russia into the Treaty of Tilsit. Europe trembled at the mere mention of his name. Any rational person would think, time to consolidate these conquests, but not Napoleon. He wanted more, always more. This is where Law 47 from Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power comes into play. Do not go past the mark you aimed for. In victory, learn when to stop. Napoleon knew all the other laws of power, applied them masterfully, but completely ignored this one, and it cost him everything. Look at Steve Jobs when he returned to Apple in 1997. He could have tried to compete in every tech sector simultaneously, but he focused laser sharp on what mattered most. He knew exactly when to stop expanding and when to perfect what he had. Napoleon, unfortunately, never learned this discipline. The first practical action you must apply today: define your limits before starting any major endeavor. Whether in your career, business, or relationships, clearly establish what constitutes enough success. Write it down, put it on your wall. Because when you're drunk on victory, your rational mind gets clouded. Napoleon had the world in his hands, but he wanted the impossible, all of Europe under his feet. And it was precisely this unchecked ambition that planted the seeds of his downfall. In the next part, you'll discover the exact moment he crossed the point of no return. If you're recognizing signs that you might be repeating Napoleon's mistake in your own life, write "limit" in the comments. Let's build a community of people who know when to stop at the right moment. Why Napoleon chose the path of destruction by invading Russia. Have you ever made a decision that you knew, deep down, was wrong? That uncomfortable feeling in your stomach, that inner voice whispering, "Stop now," but you completely ignored it? Napoleon had that exact moment in 1812, and his choice forever changed the course of world history. After dominating virtually all of Western Europe, Napoleon faced his first major systematic resistance. The English continental blockade wasn't working as expected, mainly because Russia's Tsar Alexander had begun secretly trading with England. Any experienced strategist would recommend diplomacy, negotiation, perhaps some subtle economic pressure. But not our French emperor. He chose the riskiest path possible: invading Russia with 600,000 men. 600,000, the largest army ever assembled in history up to that point. His own generals questioned this insane decision. Talleyrand, his most experienced minister, practically begged him to reconsider. But Napoleon was blind, intoxicated by power. Here, we see Law 25 of power being brutally ignored. Recreate yourself. Napoleon refused to evolve, to adapt his strategy to new realities. He kept applying the same formula of quick, decisive warfare that had worked against Austrians and Prussians, but Russia was completely different territory. Consider Warren Buffett's approach. When he realized that his early investment strategies needed updating for modern markets, he adapted. He evolved from cigar butt investing to buying wonderful companies at fair prices. He understands that even at the peak of success, you must constantly reinvent yourself. Napoleon got trapped in his own winning formula. The second practical action for your life: whenever you achieve major success, stop for a week and question your methods. Ask yourself, does this strategy still work in today's world? Do I need to reinvent myself before it's too late? Past success doesn't guarantee future success, especially when circumstances change. The Russian invasion began in June 1812. Napoleon expected a quick, decisive war, as he always had. But the Russians had a devastatingly simple strategy: retreat, burn everything, let the Russian winter do the dirty work. They knew something Napoleon refused to accept. Sometimes the best victory is not fighting at all. When the French army finally reached Moscow in September, they found an empty, burned city. There was nothing to plunder, nothing to celebrate, just the cold echo of what would be the beginning of the end of the greatest European empire since Rome. In the next part, you'll discover how pride transformed a strategic retreat into military genocide, and what specific decision definitively sealed Napoleon's fate. If you've ever made an important decision driven only by pride, even knowing it was wrong, write "pride" in the comments. Share your experience, we've all been there. How Napoleon's pride transformed a retreat into total catastrophe. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you should leave, but your pride wouldn't let you? Napoleon faced exactly this dilemma in October 1812, standing in an empty, burned Moscow. And the decision he made in that cold, silent moment cost 500,000 lives and his entire empire. When Napoleon reached Moscow and found the city devastated by the Russians themselves, any sensible commander would recognize the trap. There were no supplies, no real victory. The Russian winter was approaching like a hungry beast. "Alexander, I didn't even show up to negotiate a surrender." It was obvious, the Russians were playing a completely different game, a game of patience and endurance. Napoleon stayed in Moscow for 5 crucial weeks. 5 weeks, waiting for a peace treaty that would never come, while his troops began dying from cold and hunger. His marshals begged him to begin the retreat immediately, taking advantage of the organized military strength they still had. But here enters Law 34 of the 48 Laws of Power: be royal in your own fashion, act like a king to be treated like one. Napoleon interpreted this law completely wrong. He thought admitting the mistake and ordering a strategic retreat would make him appear weak. In reality, it would have been the most royal move possible, recognizing reality and saving hundreds of thousands of lives. Look at how Oprah Winfrey handled the end of her talk show. At the absolute peak of her success, she recognized it was time to move on to new challenges. She understood that true greatness sometimes means taking a step back at the right moment. Napoleon, unfortunately, confused stubbornness with majesty. The third practical action for you: learn to distinguish persistence from stubbornness. Persistence is continuing when you have a solid strategy and just need more time. Stubbornness is insisting on something that clearly isn't working just because your ego won't accept being wrong. Before any important decision, ask yourself, am I doing this for strategic reasons or just to save face? When Napoleon finally ordered the retreat in October, it was already too late. The Russian winter had arrived with full force. The roads were frozen, supplies non-existent. What should have been an organized strategic retreat transformed into one of the greatest military tragedies in history. Of the 600,000 men who entered Russia, only 22,000 returned in fighting condition. 578,000 soldiers lost because of one man's pride. 578,000 families destroyed, dreams shattered, empires shaken, all because someone couldn't accept they had reached their limit. The Grand Army, considered invincible, had become a ghostly memory walking through the frozen Russian steppes. If you can identify a situation in your life where you should have stopped but continued out of stubbornness, write "stubborn" in the comments. Your story might help others recognize this pattern: why Napoleon rejected his last chance to stop and how it changed the world. Imagine if I told you that even after the Russian catastrophe, Napoleon still had a golden opportunity to keep his empire and live as one of history's greatest leaders. A real proposal on the table, offered by his very enemies. And he rejected it, out of pride, because he couldn't accept that he had reached the end of his conquest journey. In March 1814, with Allied troops marching straight toward Paris, the Austrians, Prussians, and Russians made a surprising offer to Napoleon. He could keep the French throne and its natural borders: the Alps, the Rhine, the Pyrenees, practically all of modern France, plus some extra territories. For any rational person, this would be an extraordinary victory after such a devastating defeat in Russia. But Napoleon said no. He demanded to also keep Belgium, parts of Germany, parts of Italy. He wanted everything back. He couldn't accept that his time of expansion was over. Here, we see Law 47 being ignored for the last time. He simply couldn't stop, even when stopping meant keeping 90% of his conquests. Consider how Bill Gates transitioned from Microsoft CEO to philanthropist. When he realized his greatest impact would come from giving, rather than building more tech empires, he made that strategic shift. He focused on what really mattered: his legacy, global health, education. He didn't try to conquer territories where he had no advantage. Napoleon could have learned from this wisdom. The fourth and final practical action that will transform your life: develop the courage to accept partial victories. Sometimes getting 70% of what you wanted is a much bigger victory than losing 100% due to greed. Write down your primary and secondary objectives. If you achieve the primary ones, celebrate and stop. Don't destroy what you've already conquered chasing risky secondary goals. In April 1814, after refusing the last peace proposal, Napoleon was forced to abdicate completely. Sent to the island of Elba, he watched as France being occupied, his empire dismantled, his family scattered across Europe, all because he couldn't apply the simplest of power laws: knowing when to stop. The worst part, even in exile on Elba, he didn't learn the lesson. He returned for the 100 days, tried to reconquer everything again, and was definitively defeated at Waterloo. The man who could have been remembered as history's greatest strategist became a symbol of how uncontrolled ambition destroys empires. Napoleon's lesson isn't about warfare or politics. It's about you, your career, your relationships, your dreams. When you reach your moment of glory, remember, true power lies in knowing when you have enough. Don't make Napoleon's mistake. Learn when to stop, consolidate your victories, and build a lasting legacy. Share this story with someone who needs to hear this lesson. True power isn't in conquering everything, but in knowing what's worth keeping. If Napoleon's lesson made you rethink some important decision you're about to make, write "stop" in the comments and share this video with someone who needs this message.